Hi everyone, my name is Halema and I am one of the co-founding members of ADEP, the Afghan Diaspora for Equality and Progress.
And I'm Ghizal. I'm also a co-founding member of ADEP. Welcome to our first Qatra session. Our topic today is environmental justice.
So what are the Qatra Sessions? The Qatra Sessions aim to be the building blocks of a larger awareness to social injustice. And so each webinar is aimed to be one Qatra or one drop that delves into pertinent topics of today.
So let's just get into it. I want to start off with a story. Have you heard of Fremont, California? I'm guessing many of you have. Home to little Kabul, a huge Afghan population. You know what else has found a home in Fremont? A lot of large industrial companies, specifically companies that make cleaning products. For years and years, these companies have been releasing industrial waste in the soil.
For me, electric is the future.
Or I'm also sure you've heard of Tesla, the car company. You know, it's a green company, good for the environment. Tesla has a manufacturing plant in Fremont. And just in April, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, cited them for hazardous waste violations. So while their motto may be to sell electric cars to the rich to protect the environment, in Fremont, California, they failed to comply with air emission standards for equipment leaks or determination of hazardous waste.
So why is this important? Well, because right there you see the major difference between what environmentalism is and what environmental justice is and how that affects us, Afghans. Because we live, breathe, eat like everyone else, so when everyone else is facing contamination, so are we.
And so what's environmental justice? Well, first, we have to clear up what environmentalism is. Environmentalism is a social movement dedicated to environmental integrity and preservation. Environmental justice, on the other hand, is a social movement dedicated to the equal distribution of environmental goods and decision-making. It is never just concerned about the wilderness. So many times these topics are conflated or used interchangeably, but that's wrong. They couldn't be more different. Since at least the early 1990s, leaders in the environmental justice movement have criticized what are mainstream environmental movements, racism and classism. To some extent, it echoes the idea of wilderness being an invention of rich, white, European, and American men, which excluded women, other classes, and caused genocidal destruction upon indigenous populations. So do you recognize these people? In the 1960s, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huertas, leaders of the United Farm Workers, organized not just for farm workers' rights, but to oppose the harmful pesticides being used in the farms of California's San Joaquin Valley. Then in 1967 in Houston, Black people protested a city garbage dump that took the life of a child. But what really triggered the environmental justice movement, and what most historians point to, was in 1982 in North Carolina, where individuals wanted to take soil contaminated by PCB and move it to a landfill in Warren County. Warren County is located primarily in an area where there are people of color. People came out in droves on the street. A U.S. congressman even got arrested. So people started paying attention. In the 1990s, leaders in the environmental justice movement started looking for allies among traditional, primarily white environmental organizations, spaces like the Sierra Club. These groups like the Sierra Club were groups that fought to protect endangered species, protect wilderness, but had little to no involvement in the struggle people of color faced under constant assault of hazardous facilities. So these leaders in the environmental justice movements wrote a letter to the Big Ten environmental groups, accusing them of racial bias and demanded them to address toxic contamination in neighborhoods of color, in their branding and the diversity of their staff. Slowly, some of these organizations began to take on the environmental justice movement.
So let's get a little more into it. A city is ideally made up of people of all different classes and races and genders. However, based on exclusionary housing policy and zoning, we find that people tend to be divided up by race or class within a city. Environmental justice in a city deals with the fact that areas that tend to be richer have access to open spaces, parks, healthy and organic eating options, and typically are away from the highway or a lot of pollution. Whereas other parts of the city, with primarily people of color, you have heavily polluted ports, close to highways and pollution, and hazardous waste that pollute the air and water. In this same city, people may be living in the same exact area code, but their race, ethnicity, wealth, and income bracket causes them to experience vastly different qualities of air, water, and life. San Francisco is a pretty good example. In San Francisco alone, the rate of infant deaths of the black population is 5 times higher than whites, even though the birth rate is much lower.
Flint, Michigan is one of the most egregious examples of environmental racism. The way it began was in 2014, a state employee decided to save money and change Flint's water source to the Flint River, but didn't treat it for corrosion. This allowed lead and other contaminants to get into the water source. Residents noticed, but the state dismissed the concerns and gave false assurances to the public that would take care of their issues. They didn't even acknowledge the issue until October 2015, over a year later. Here you have the classic case of environmental racism, where there is no local representation in the decision-making, such as switching the water source. The fact that there was no corrective justice. Decision makers are slow or don't move at all to remedy the situation and prevent further harm. All of these embedded into larger social justice issues.
Ghizal, what's the population like in Flint? Do you think race and socioeconomic class play a role in the crisis?
Absolutely. The population estimates are approximately 100,000. About 57% of the population is Black.
So, Ghizal, we keep hearing about various environmental issues in the media. Is environmental racism or environmental justice a new phenomenon, or is this something that has been going on for a while and we just haven't been paying attention to it?
Oh, absolutely not. It is not a new phenomenon. A very easy way to see how environmental racism has persisted in many cities and regions is taking a closer look at New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina is another classic example of environmental racism. The poverty among Blacks in New Orleans was really, really high, making them unable to live in areas that protected them from floodwaters and were well maintained by the government. So, of course, what happened? Around the time of Hurricane Katrina, the levees broke. And what happened in Katrina is a reflection of the history of racism and inequality in the Gulf Coast region as a whole. Poor people of color were most affected by Hurricane Katrina and still to this day are. As a result of the floodwaters, we keep hearing about the flood, but as a result of the floodwaters, toxic substances were leaked out into the environment and into the air and water where they used to live and still live in many areas. But it really was about how a history of environmental racism exacerbated the situation and caused great harm for people of color. This didn't happen overnight. The levees happened, the hurricane happened, but it was really a steep history of environmental racism in this area.
Gee, do you think that the federal government response to Hurricane Katrina was related to environmental racism? I mean, there's the famous, clip of Kanye saying that George Bush doesn't care about Black people. Do you think that it's a related phenomenon between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just environmental justice as a definition has race tied into it and socioeconomic status. So it's really hard to separate the two. And you see in studies that in areas where there are large populations of color, environmental racism is a bigger effect. So naturally, the response is going to be much more stalled. You see this in areas where fracking is an issue or other environmental consequences or environmental oppression happens. When white people mobilize, their voices get heard. They throw around things like environmental review and environmental impact reports. Here in San Francisco, it's a major thing. You have areas, white areas of the city who come out in droves fighting things like pollution. which is great. You should always fight pollution and look for a more transit-oriented society. But if those same people come out in different areas, um, you don't get the same response. You don't get the same response until a lot of times you have your allies. That's not to say that people of color aren't mobilized in these cities. They are mobilized. Particularly Black and Indigenous populations are heavily mobilized and coming out against environmental oppression and racism. But that's not to say that they have this, the same political power or political leverage that other communities might have, particularly in areas in the South, for example, in New Orleans, where, there's a history of racism and oppression that is still there. It's just more hidden in environmental effects.
So a lot of discussions around race being the primary factor for a lack of infrastructure is usually from the South, right? Alabama, Mississippi, what's essentially called the Black Belt, right? The North, however, is not immune to instances of Black communities forced into living in hazardous conditions. Syracuse, New York is a prime example of this. There is currently a state highway that dissects the Black community, has a history of industrial waste dumping in the neighborhood, and then a proposal for a sewage plant to worsen it. Spoiler alert, the residents of Syracuse did not win that argument. The sewage treatment plant was approved. EPA's Office of Civil Rights, without having visited the area or interviewing residents at all, dismissed the complaints and moved forward with their plans. The Syracuse case shows how civil rights law, Title VI to be precise, can be used in instances of environmental justice.
And while we talk about civil rights law and Title VI, environmental racism is not just an American or Western issue, though often the perpetrators of environmental racism can be American or Western. In Ecuador, Chevron, the third largest company in the United States as measured by gross revenue, has been deliberately dumping waste in the Amazon rainforest in eastern Ecuador. Texaco, which was taken over by Chevron in 2001, dumped toxic waste into over 1,000 pits and spilled billions of gallons of oil-exposed water into a 1,700 square mile area from 1972 to 1992. Yeah, it was 1972, but techniques for waste disposal already existed then. The way they were disposing of the waste was outlawed in the United States at that time, and they went ahead and did it in Ecuador. It is an issue of environmental racism. For the past 27 years, the indigenous Ecuadorians living in the Amazon have been caught up in massive international legal cases that does not appear to be ending anytime soon. But how layered is environmental racism? The media has taken on Chevron's claims that the Ecuadorian extortionists and American lawyers are utilizing the corrupt Ecuadorian legal corporation to strip an innocent corporation, Chevron. So speaking of innocent corporations, let's talk about e-waste. What's e-waste? You may have heard of it. E-waste is a name given to electronic products such as cell phones, laptops, toys, and digital cameras that has reached what is called its end of life. It is now considered the fastest growing waste stream in the world. And the United States alone last year produced 10 million tons of e-waste. And while it is legal to export used electronic items to be reused or refurbished, in reality, many Western countries are classifying their dead, non-usable electronic items as merely used to avoid the cost of legitimate and legal recycling. And so what happens to this e-waste? A lot of this e-waste goes to the developing world, particularly West African countries, where treatment occurs in the informal sector, exposing the local population with many environmental and health risks. And once in a landfill, these items are toxic. The toxic materials contaminate the land, water, and the air. The e-waste problem is on its track to turning into a global health crisis affecting the developing world. This is a result of many Western nations finding loopholes and avoiding legitimate recycling to avoid the associated costs. So yeah, while recycling can appear to be a white thing, maybe if we were more thoughtful about where our waste is going and who it's affecting, we feel more connected to the plight on the other side.
The developing world often receives the wastes that the Western world produces, but it is also home to many natural disasters. Bangladesh has a 4-month monsoon season, with a quarter of the country only 7 feet above water. Yes, you heard that right. The quarter of country only 7 feet above water. A population of 163 million residents in one of the world's most populous deltas, Bangladesh is often referred to as ground zero for climate change. Rural communities, in particular those who reside in low-level coastal areas, are the most affected, with risks that can't even be managed. Erosion in these riverbanks display 50,000 to 20,000 residents every year. The storms destroy homes and livelihood, but also increase the salinity of the soil and water, leaving very little for people to eat and drink. The rural Bengalis leave the countryside for Dhaka, but end up living in the poorest and most flood-prone areas, remaining within the grasp of sea level rise and climate change. Climate experts say that by 2050, 17% of the country will be submerged and about 20 million people will be displaced. While Bangladesh is just the size of Iowa, Dhaka itself has 18 million people. It is one of the fastest growing megacities in the world. This in turn puts a major strain on the city's infrastructure and to its slums, which contain about 1 million people. More than the population of San Francisco live in Dhaka's slums. Ghizal, do you think there's a correlation between socioeconomic status and how the response to environmental issues are handled?
Yes, while race is a big indicator of how environmental effects are recognized and treated, there's definitely a correlation between socioeconomic status and the oppressive behavior of industries like the fossil fuel industry, for example. Take, for example, the rural poor in Appalachia. Here in the United States, mining and fracking in Appalachia have found to be correlated with increased rates of illnesses in the surrounding communities. But what is fracking? Fracking is a drilling technique used for extracting oil or natural gas from underground. And there's been a fairly recent fracking boom in the United States because the cost of importing oil and other fossil fuels have gone high. This has led to a ton of political and environmental concerns and a lot of debate. With all the uncertainty, the Federal Office of Surface Mining and Enforcement announced in 2016 that they would fund a study by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to review the research between adverse health effects and stuff like coal mining, as well as a lot of unknown impacts and indicators of natural gas drilling. But then Trump happened. And in August 2017, the US Secretary of the Interior sent a letter to the National Academy of Sciences ordering it to halt its research into the links between health impacts and mountaintop coal removal mining. Sounds like someone may be bought out by perhaps the fossil fuel industry.
From national government agencies playing a role in environmental decisions to local, state, and county, we see a recurring theme of a lack of environmental justice. Taking it back to the US. The US South has historically been tied to poverty. It's not difficult to see how that's taken shape since the outlawing of chattel slavery, the ensuing sharecropping, and a Jim Crow era that further crippled the Southern Black population. Hookworm, a disease of extreme poverty, is thriving in Lowndes County, Alabama. For some context, it was through this county that Martin Luther King Jr. led marchers from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. The current population of Lowndes County is 74% Black, with an average income of just $18,000. So how is it that a disease scientists once thought was completely eradicated in the 1980s still thriving in the US as one of the richest countries in the world? The answer is really just a lack of proper sanitation system, or even a basic one. In a Baylor survey, 73% of residents reported that they had been exposed to raw sewage washing back into their homes because of faulty septic tanks, or waste pipes becoming so overwhelmed with torrential rain that they overflow. So you would think naturally that the county or the state government would assist. The county, though, has not been any help. They expect residents to fund their own septic tanks while issuing fines for any makeshift piping. The county once jailed a grandmother for a few days because she could not buy a septic tank, something that's worth more than her entire yearly income. The question here is, why aren't there funds allocated to build a basic sanitation system, either through the county or through the state government? And would there be a different outcome if the population were, let's say, wealthier or of a majority different race?
Environmental justice and racism spans many different issues and topics, and it's not just related to waste and climate change, even though those are major aspects. Something that it's probably a little bit more relatable to those of us who live in large cities is the concept of a food desert. Food deserts are areas in which access to clean, healthy food is not there, or if it is there, is unaffordable. So urban areas like San Francisco, Oakland, and New York City are places where food deserts have become a real issue, though there are attempts at making affordable, healthy, and fresh food and groceries accessible. ADEP was lucky enough to host a member of the Oakland Food Policy Council at our Summer Leadership Initiative in 2018, where the concept of environmental and social justice and food policy became even more apparent. So when we think of food policy and we think of healthy groceries, we also need to think about land use and how these are all broadly connected to how and where people of color are living. Bodegas, fast food chains, and liquor stores are common in lower income areas, but do we necessarily want a Whole Foods to move in next door? What does a brand new Trader Joe's on your block signal to the real estate market? How do we allow access to the land, both inside of our bodies and around our bodies, be equitable and fair? How do we provide access without removing jobs and paving a path to residential displacement? Zoning and land use is an issue, where we decide we can locate things, where we think our power plants should go, where we build our housing, who's located next to a freeway, who's located next to a toxic dump, who gets access to what water, where do we build our affordable housing? Commercial gentrification and displacement is an environmental justice issue too.
So, Ghizal, in your experience working as a city planner for the city of San Francisco, what are some things that you have seen that have either helped the situation in San Francisco, or have there been ways where it's just like out of your control and nothing that you can really do to prevent some of these things from happening? Is that a good question?
Yeah, it's very easy to feel helpless in these situations, especially if you feel like you're just one person against a whole system of environmental racism and oppression. I think what's helped our city is having a kind of racial equity lens and approach to all of these things. So our city has developed a racial equity tool in which we evaluate how certain projects and development might affect people of color and primarily Black communities. And this is because, for example, in San Francisco, the Black population in 2013 was roughly 6.5%, and today it's 3%. So just in such a short period of time, we've lost about half the Black population. And this is due to lack of affordable housing, obviously, but also it's an environmental justice issue. It's the fact that areas that we are now cleaning up, we're cleaning up so that it's ready for new people to move in. It's ready for rich people to come and buy condos. It's ready for the Warrior Stadium or the redoing of Monster Park. These are all issues that affect San Francisco and affects many cities across the country. And also when talking about things like access to health, and which is an environmental justice issue, we think about things like transportation, which is a land use issue. So essentially, the Department of Public Health offers communities in the Bayview, particularly women, Black women, a subsidy to come to the Department of Public Health in downtown San Francisco to work, to just do studies and surveys so they can get more information. But transportation is like a major issue. If it's going to take them an hour to get there, an hour back, then you actually don't have the numbers you need to make smarter health decisions for this community. So, it's not only just about doing the bare minimum to get information and surveys. It's about like going above and beyond and basically making it more, just making it like having them having it not be a burden to come out. So not only do you have to pay for their transportation, you should be offering them food, you should be offering them childcare, you should be offering a gift card for something, and just to overcome some of these issues, because in San Francisco, the neonatal death mortality rate is like obscenely high. It's like 5 times higher than the rest of the San Francisco population. So
And
there's
that's
a reason.
specific to the Black population.
Yeah.
You want to tell people that their concern and their desire for clean air and clean water is elitist? Tell that to the kids in the South Bronx, which are suffering from the highest rates of childhood asthma in the country. Tell that to the families in Flint.
So we've just gone into a lot of different case studies that talk about different issues within the environment. And so one of the things that we keep hearing in the media is this Green New Deal, right? And you have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez supporting it, other progressives pushing this idea forward. And so, Ghizal, from what you've seen and what you know, is the Green New Deal something that will help alleviate some of the issues that we've highlighted in the case studies, or does it fall short in some of the things that you think needs to happen in order for there to be essentially justice served?
Yeah, and just as a disclaimer, I'm not an environmental policy expert, but from what I have read, the Green New Deal sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? For you American history buffs, it sounds kind of like FDR's New Deal, which was a series of public works programs and financial reforms. And that's what essentially the Green New Deal is. It's not a single project or even legislation, but it's a different way about how we think about our environmental goals and outcomes, and how they might be if we reevaluate the ways in which we think about and interact with our natural and built environment. And so essentially the Green New Deal is a plan introduced by Congress that lays out a way in which we might be able to address climate change. But not only does this deal aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also addresses the overall issue of environmental racism slightly. So how do we make most people listen and most people care? Talk to them about money. Research shows that the United States could lose billions of dollars because of climate change. And just last year, the United States' carbon emissions rose by 3.4%, more percentage points than past years. So a main resolution in this deal is that the entire world needs to get to zero net emissions by 2050. That's 30 years. It's saying that our goal should be to absorb just as much carbon as we release in the atmosphere, and that the United States needs to lead that charge. And the way to achieve these goals is been thought about as a 10-year process that the deal lays out, in which we source 100% of the country's electricity from renewable zero emissions power. We digitize the nation's power grid, and we upgrade every building in the country to be more power efficient, but also by investing in electric vehicles and high-speed rail. And that all sounds great, but what's the social justice component of the Green New Deal? There are a lot of communities that rely on jobs in the fossil fuel industries, and a lot of these are poor communities. Well, the deal also says that the government must provide job training and new economic development opportunities in these very communities around, clean energy. Aside from this, however, as displayed in all our case studies, environmental oppression affects communities of color, period. So reevaluating things like waste disposal or power plants or infrastructure will inherently lift up communities of color, because they're the ones suffering the causes and the consequences of living this way. It is, however, important to be outright specific and demand clarification, because we know what politicians do best. They're vague.
So how do we as US citizens influence change when November comes around and the Green New Deal continues to be a hot button issue?
Have your politicians name it. Knowing what the Green New Deal is and what it does gives you, the voter, more power to engage in more conversations about the potential policies and proposals. Demand race be named. Demand socioeconomic status be named. Instead of allowing the Green New Deal to remain a campaign slogan, ask your politicians about e-waste. Ask them what they're doing in Bangladesh. Ask about water scarcity. Ask about Syracuse. Ask about Appalachia. Ask about Fremont, California, where corporations are still polluting the water.
So, Ghazal, a lot of the information that we've presented in all the case studies, both in the U.S., internationally, it can seem overwhelming. So, where do we even start in making impactful change, and how can we work towards sustainability?
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, and it is. But I think the first step is actually knowing the issues, knowing things like e-waste, knowing where your electronic products are going. I think it takes a lot of resilience. It takes community development, reconstructing your mind to how you think about waste and environmentalism. I think it's about knowing the difference between environmental justice and environmentalism. I think it's about claiming space, both physically and in the spheres of environmentalism. I think it's like all issues, local politics, being locally involved with the environmental concerns of your city and county. Guarantee there's an environmental justice component in your city that certain people are currently finding and fighting. Find out what those are. See how you can plug in and use your expertise as either a doctor, a health official, a lawyer, a marketer. There are so many skills our communities have. If we can channel these into environmental justice and how we interact with the environment, I think it will become a topic that more of us start talking about. I think that learning about facts about coal mining and fracking, demanding research in these areas where people are in denial because they say that research doesn't exist would help. All of these are ways in which we can plug in, and it can seem a little less overwhelming. Nobody's saying to go to the United Nations and join the Paris Accords, even though that would be great if you want to. But it's more about finding locally how you can be involved. For example, we talk about food deserts and access to fresh, healthy groceries. The Oakland Food Policy Council is one place you can plug in if you're in the Bay Area. I guarantee that if you're in an urban area, this is an issue. If you're near Michigan, see what's going on in Flint. Bring it to the forefront. We don't need to wait until things blatantly affect just the Afghan community for us to plug in. We expect other communities of color to show up for us. How are we showing up for them? While environmental racism does affect us, we don't necessarily see it because it's hidden. It's, insidious. It's like most forms of racism today.
So, G, sometimes on the internet, like you'll see these like trends and things where people are following, and a recent one that I've seen is save the turtles, stop using plastic straws, and while that's pretty cute and hipsterish and all that. I think there is some truth to it, right? Same with plastic bags and making sure we don't use plastic bags. And I guess the question is, what are some ways in an everyday type of way where we can make our footprint on the earth a little bit less wasteful, a little bit less harsh on the environment?
Yeah, we're treading into environmentalism territory over environmental justice, which is great because one is not mutually exclusive of the other. I think a good way to do that is first, obviously, to be plugged into your issues, but also, these laws exist for a reason, and a lot of people fought really hard to bring it to the forefront. And a lot of times they are seen as like white issues, but the environmental effects of, for example, plastic bags are affecting places in like Southeast Asia. It's affecting communities of color. It's affecting poor communities. So it is about the turtles, but it's also about like your communities in Southeast Asia that are being affected by this massive amount of plastic in the ocean. I think other small ways that I'm just going to throw out there, things like composting is like a really big deal. Learning what that is. I know it's really confusing at first, but it's actually a good way to reduce your carbon footprint. In your workplace, there's ways to instill environmentally friendly ways of working, whether it's like digitization efforts or whether it's stuff like reusable water, not having a lot of a lot of garbage space. So in our work, for example, we have huge compost bins, huge recycle bins, but we have a very small garbage bin because in reality, very few things can need to go into a landfill. Another way to do it is at work, we have a plastic bag collector, and a lot of people don't realize that plastic bags aren't recyclable or compostable. They actually need to be recycled in a very specific way, and a lot of grocery stores collect them, places like Safeway. So at work, we have an area where we collect plastic bags, and one person volunteers every week to go and dispose of them as they wish. So there are little ways in which we can reduce our footprints, just really being mindful and changing your habits and practices. I mean, we talk a lot, but we got to put our mouth where our money is. And that's just making small changes. And that's the duty, that's the tax that we pay on being citizens of this earth and being lucky enough that this earth exists. Because for all we know, it's the only planet with
Water.
with water, with life. But we haven't done intergalactic travel yet, so to be determined.
Well, one thing I do want to point out, in San Francisco, there's these strict plastic laws, right? My first trip to San Francisco, I did not know this. So I went to, I think, either a Safeway or a Target or something along those lines, and they gave me no plastic bag, and I'm like, how do I carry this? So, as you can tell, the East Coast and the area that I'm from, the tri-state area, don't have these laws yet. And so what we've done as an office, we've started just having a separate side bin where people put their water bottles, their empty water bottles, or their empty glass bottles of any sort that's recyclable. And we just leave it there purposely for the building maintenance people and the building people to collect. And so, hopefully all of New York City isn't like that, but like if it is, that's a lot of things that are not being properly disposed of. So, that's just one example of just at an office level, making sure things are being separated the way that they should be.
Yeah. And also I find it sometimes it's a cop out. Like, is it a new building?
No, it's not. Manhattan doesn't have many new buildings unless they're the new high rises, like apartment buildings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this building has been there in Midtown for ages. So the fact that there is no standardized way for this building to collect these things, it's fishy. And I wouldn't be surprised if more buildings in the area like also do the same thing.
Yeah, it's just so weird because what's the difference between collecting garbage and the space required for collecting garbage and the space required for collecting recycling bin? They are all dedicated areas within a building. They all have separate rooms usually where, they collect. So is it a matter of pickup? Then in that case, then you need to petition your city.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, it's just complicated and layered, especially in really old historic cities.
Yeah. The thing with New York, though, like there is specific days where they pick up like regular garbage. There are specific days where recyclables are picked up. So it's not a matter of there not being the infrastructure. Like New York sanitation is pretty decent when it comes to that. It seems like it's more so the building. So it was all like we've talked about a lot of different topics. We've brought up a lot of different issues. As ADEP's resident city planner and environmental expert, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
I don't know.
Okay, cool. So we're going to transition into a Q&A now, so we'll see you guys shortly.
Whoa, what's going on? Do you guys see us? So basically we time traveled. And thank you for putting up with the disconnect between the audio and the video. I mean, these are just growing pains. This is our first Qatra session, so hopefully you got the information out of it, even though it looked a little weird.
And with us, we have our gracious ADEP one of the co-founders, Arash. He's decided to bless us and help us field some of the questions that you guys may have.
So for anybody that's tuning in, if you have questions, we're going to open up a Q&A box, so you'll be able to ask your questions. There you go. I know that's like a lot of info, and I'll speak from like a personal perspective. I consider myself like a race guy, as you can tell by my shirt. You know, like racial justice is what got me interested in social justice first. You know, it was like the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then thinking about like marginalized communities in terms of racial and then maybe gender like a few years later because you know I'm a man, and then like the environment and the environmental justice is just not something that I really thought about much in my maybe teens and 20s, and something I've been thinking about later on because of climate change and other things. So it's interesting to get all this information all at the same time. My question is, what is Title VI exactly? It's one thing that stood out to me, and how does it relate to what you two were talking about?
Yeah, I'm happy to try and tackle that. I know we have an attorney listening in, so if you need to correct me, Wise, please go ahead and jump in, either turn on your mic or type it in. But essentially, Title VI is a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What it essentially does, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin, and any program or activity that receives federal funds or other federal financial assistance. And a lot of programs and funds do receive federal financial assistance. So so this basically essentially prohibits that kind of racism and gender discrimination. I hope that makes sense. Weiss, did I get it right? I think he's typing right now. If he wants to share in a bit more. I got it. Okay, great. Yeah, so a lot in like, for example, in San Francisco, a lot of affordable housing programs and a lot of like, for example, highway programs relies on federal funds. So I'm going to study for the bar exam now. Thanks.
For anybody watching, feel free to ask any questions. You can just type it in the little chat box that we have there. Ghizal, maybe I'll throw you another question as a resident of San Francisco. What do you think, what can you point to that San Francisco is doing right? Like maybe an example that like other cities or other parts of the country can follow? So what's San Francisco doing right in terms of environmental justice? And maybe you can point out something that it's like really doing wrong and like other places in the country and the world should avoid.
That's hard. Hopefully nobody from work ever finds this video. If you do, this is not happening during work hours. So essentially, I think what we're doing right, I think our research on sea level rise is really great. I think we're very far ahead than any other city in the country. We've kind of laid the groundwork, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that Ocean Beach has an erosion problem right now, and it's like immediate. It's happening right now. So there's a lot of effort and resources going into studying the effects of what's happening along Ocean Beach, which is on the western side of the city. Also on the eastern side of the city, we have a lot of flooding occurring when there's a lot of heavy storms. And that area, a lot of it's man-made. It's landfill, so it's not the natural coastline. So I think what we're doing right is I think we have the money and the resources and the political willpower because climate change has become such a big thing and almost like a buzzword in many ways. So you have the mayor and the board of supervisors really pushing forth this effort on research and doing all that kind of like information searching, gathering, and needs assessment and seeing what needs to go where, how transportation is going to be affected. What I think we're kind of lagging behind is still the environmental justice component. I think many people have heard about certain areas of San Francisco where corporations have lied about the results of toxic hazardous waste. What are we doing right now as a result of that? Are we doing the information and the research correctly? What are we doing to correct that? And these are areas where there's communities of color and also areas where they're redeveloping to build more land. So it's kind of layered, and I think any area where you have a big influx of population, so places like Washington, D.C. and New York City, even Los Angeles, these are all issues that are going to come to your city. It's just the fact that San Francisco is experiencing it first because of the tech boom. So it's really important to stay ahead of the curve and see what other cities are doing correctly or not correctly, and going learning from that, I guess.
We have a question, and I'll let either Arash or Ghizal, one of you guys can answer. The question is from Rizwan. What do you feel are roadblocks to the Green New Deal and ways we might be able to address them? It's a good question.
The Republican Party, I mean, like, basically, like, I mean, does anybody want to take that on? Or
I mean, I would say even more so than the Republican Party, I think it's just the establishment in general. It's also the Democratic Party. I think what we noticed since past November, since this new Democratic members got elected, it's AOC and the others that are advocating for this. It's not Pelosi's plan. It's not Boyer's plan. It's not Schumer's plan. And I think also the Democratic establishment is not serious about this because of corporate funding and corporate power. It's really capitalism and corporatism that's getting in the way of any of this being implemented. At the end of the day, America is a capitalistic country, and I think the political willpower is not there yet, but it's making strides. I think people are starting to take it more seriously, but until I think the corporations kind of let go of some of the political power they have, it'll be hard to see it being implemented.
yeah, I also think, to add on to that, opponents of the Green New Deal are really commenting on how expensive it's going to be, and that's what the Republicans have really held on to. And it's, I mean, any type of policy or program is going to come at an expense. You just determine who's going to pay for that expense, right? So I think that's been the major roadblock, especially with Republicans. However, if you actually dig in a little bit deeper and you see that in the long term, we're actually saving money by investing in things like clean energy and highway infrastructure. And these aren't new concepts. I mean, you travel to Asia, you travel to a lot of different parts of the world. We have the technology to do this. We have the technology to do this today. Like, if we wanted to, we could right now be completely self-sufficient on clean energy. We just choose not to. And why do we choose not to? Because things like money, right? And then it's like, who's paying for it? Are the corporations? The corporations are going to lose money, and that's why they're fighting it so hard. So who's actually, the burden of it is going to places like communities of color that or like the Appalachia, where the poor rural communities are paying for it in their health risks. So you just have to be plugged into the conversation. I mean, it's just a cop out to say like it's, expensive. Everything's freaking expensive.
I mean, we could certainly cut back on, let's say, like military spending. That's a huge chunk of the federal budget, to be able to allocate for funds like this. So it really is a level of willpower, like I think Arash said, in order to get this across the finish line and actually implemented.
And I'll add on, because I went to the Green New Deal tour. So they toured around the country, and at first it was something rather small. They did a sit-in Pelosi's office, and this was in November on like the very first day. Everyone got inaugurated, and then they did a tour, and now they're asking for one of the Democratic debates to be about climate change. And on each single one of those things, they've made progress. When they did a sit-in Pelosi's office, they managed to get Pelosi to like consider legislation, and then they went on a tour. And I was there, and I know Washington D.C. is a liberal, progressive city, and it's not like the rest of the country. But I mean, it was packed. There were like 100 journalists there. There were all these young people who were definitely interested to learn about the Green New Deal. And I think what the most interesting aspect about it is that it's a framework. It's an idea. It's not legislation. They're saying, hey, here's what we ought to do. Here are the goals, but how we're going to do it and what the legislation is going to be is not determined yet, because usually what happens is corporations come in and they say, hey, if we're going to reform healthcare, this is how we want it to be. And I think for the first time in a very long time, they're trying to do things differently, and I think that appeals to a lot of people.
Yeah. Is that when they went into, I think it was Dianne Feinstein's office, and she had this like weird reaction to all the children who came out against what she was talking about? But yeah, I think it's so important because I always tell people this, and I don't know if I ever get it through, or if I just sound like a broken record, but like climate change really is tied to every single issue ever. Like, it sounds really dramatic, but I think ADEP put out a blog on environmental justice, I think a little bit over a year ago, and it ties into how things like, Elon Musk's desire to colonize Mars, or the Syrian conflicts, or, civil rights issues, how these all are they're like centered around things like water, material scarcity, like resource scarcity, water scarcity. So, I mean, it's doing everybody a disservice if this is not at the forefront of the 2020 elections. It needs to be asked in every single debate multiple times, and we need to get like solid answers, not like, oh, hey, yeah, I support the Green New Deal because it sounds good, and like FDR, yay,
We have another question from Wise. The question is, do you struggle balancing the push for individualized solutions, recycling by dropping plastic off at drop-off location, etc., versus pushing for more corporate responsibility? That's a good question.
Who wants to do that?
So I think I'll go first and take a stab at this. I feel like the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, in the sense that you can do your own part and you have much more control over that. So you can control, how you're recycling, how you're throwing things away, making sure that they're categorized in the right way. And then also, try at least to hold these corporations accountable by either reaching out to your state senator, reaching out to your congressperson. I will say that I find, corporate responsibility and finding ways as like one person to hold corporations accountable a little bit more difficult. And it seems like a much more daunting task than for me to like separate my plastics and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. The way I tend to look at it is like, for example, you have the issues of like diabetes and like the prevalence of diabetes in like people of color, and then your individual like actions to prevent your health, to maintain your health. So, there's like a community issue, and then there's like an individual issue, and one does not absolve you from the other. I think, yeah, it gets annoying when it becomes things about like turtle memes and stuff, but I also, but also I think just realizing how those small things, like re-narrate it to yourself, re-narrate it so it becomes a big issue. Re-narrate the fact that you're using plastic bags where it becomes like a corporate issue. I think if you're able to do that, you're able to see like the end result much more clearer. Because something else that happens, what corporations like to do, I lost my train of thought. What corporations like to do. Oh, okay. So the ways in which environmentalism can actually be vehicles of white supremacy is when we don't realize how environmentalism can actually affect communities of color apart from environmental justice. And that is done by things like overpopulation. Who do they blame for overpopulation? It's always communities of color. It's always communities of colors in these large cities. Why are you having so much children if you can't afford it? So things like overpopulation is a global issue, right? But is it really about like communities of colors having kids, or is it about the distribution of resources, or things about like how plastic, like it's just about reframing the debate. If it's about displacement and gentrification, which are all worthy causes to take up, talk more about brownfields, talk more about where this development is happening and how the toxicity of this development is being imposed on other people. So it is about, I think we can't absolve ourselves from corporate responsibility just because we don't necessarily understand how our day-to-day actions affect people globally. Our plastic usage does affect people globally. That is holding corporate responsibility. You have enough people caring about that, you have, then you won't have as much plastic, hopefully. So,
and I also think corporate responsibility now happens and works in more interesting ways. If you look at companies like Google and Wayfair, they've had walkouts, right? So there's workers very dissatisfied with what's going on there. Wayfair being the ICE detention camp that Wayfair has been selling to the government, and like Google has had sexual harassment suits, and I think Yahoo or another company was involved in a Pentagon drone contract, and workers protested enough where those companies had to abandon that. So those companies have power, and we're talking about how much power corporations have. So that is also something to think about. We have another question from Imran. He says, forgive the pessimism, but do y'all think we, the next generation of people, would have to basically preserve until the older generation that is currently in control essentially to die off in order for us to expedite progress? That way our generation outnumbers there in terms of political representation. If I'm thinking about this the wrong way, feel free to correct me. At the end of the day, policymakers are basically calling the shots. Very, very challenging question, I think, here. But I will say there's more millennials now than there are more millennials who are grandparents than there are freshmen in college. So that's something to think about. Like the debate has shifted, and the generation we're talking about, they just happen to vote in higher numbers. So maybe it's a little bit about voter mobilization. Any of you two want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I agree. I also, sorry, Halema.
No, go.
I agree. I also think the same way about Afghanistan sometimes. I know that's really messed up, but I'm like, oh, do all the older people in Afghanistan need to just like go away so like we can do it right? That's probably not the right way to think about it, but that's like in a similar vein, I think about it that way. Also, it's like in San Francisco, the board of supervisor, I know, Imran, you're guilty of that too, me too. In San Francisco, the board of supervisors did some research about who are the people who are voting in San Francisco, right? And so this goes back to voter mobilization, because you have this huge millennial boom in San Francisco where everybody's like average age 35. I don't know if the average age is 35, but for example, 35, they're all really young. They have a ton of money, supposedly progressive, but none of them are voting. The voting rate is so low among these new people in San Francisco. So really, I think it's really about not just letting them die off, but I think it's also just about mobilizing. Like, if you care, then you need to vote. I think voter mobilization is a good way to like silence them.
I think a really good example of this, if you look at our homegirl Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I mean, she was going up against a basically veteran Democrat of her district, and people thought that she was out of her mind challenging him. I think it was Crowley, and so the entire Democratic establishment was behind him. They just thought she was kind of this newcomer, didn't really know what she was doing, young, progressive. They didn't think it was going to happen, but we all saw what the results of that were. So while the older generation, yes, it may seem that they have all the power, that they're calling the shots, I think the tides are starting to turn, especially as more of the people that are 18 and older right now are voting. They're much more in tune and picking up on what the nation is doing, what policymakers are doing. So I think it's only a matter of time and only a matter of a couple more election cycles where essentially we end up voting out a lot of these veterans and these old people out of office.
And maybe just to add a little bit, I think what AOC and others have talked about is the failure of imagination. We try to look pragmatically and realistically at what's going on and what is the status quo here in Washington D.C. or another place, and we're like, oh well, the corporations have so much power, and these policymakers are never going to change anything. Well, to try and imagine a whole new economy, a whole new world, and a whole new Green Deal, I think is powerful. Just to be in a room. When I went to the Green Deal tour in DC, it was just amazing and powerful and energizing to see so many people who cared about the environment, environmental justice, and climate change. And I think that alone can be very powerful and inspiring.
So we have one more question. I think this will be our last question since we are over time a little bit by a couple minutes. Tuba asks, there was a big explosion and fire from a refinery that uses an extremely hazardous chemical in a poor community in Philadelphia at the end of June. And there is a Clean Air Council in the city that is challenging the city and asking for immediate investigation. But how do my peers and I keep city officials accountable after a man-made disaster? It's a really good question.
Yeah. It reminds me of kind of what happened in California with all the fires and PG&E and the destruction of so many homes. And a lot of those people were pretty poor. I mean, this is just taking up the corporations essentially. Does anybody else want to add on before I go on my soapbox?
No, go for it.
Okay, no soapbox, but I mean, this is like it's like really devastating. I'm glad that there is a clean air council in the city, but where I would first start out is who's on that council, where their political interests align, and just keeping up with the meetings, keeping up with, the decisions. A lot of these events and meetings are publicly aired. It's actually required by law in San Francisco. If you have, 4 officials getting together that are on a commission or a council, it's required to be publicly aired. So, a lot of these meetings are publicly aired, and it's just good to just be tuned in, and not just to be tuned in, but listen to what's happening on the ground, what the community is saying, mobilize the community as much as possible. I don't know. And PG&E, like, they're trying to declare, I don't know if it went through, but they're trying to declare bankruptcy so that they can be absolved of all their, the cost associated with rebuilding the thousands of acres of homes that were destroyed in the fire by their.
Yeah, I'm on the Clean Air website now, and so apparently there's they're doing a 4-person investigation, and it's just like this. So this is something recent. They're going to investigate. It's going to take months. The bureaucracy involved, just to stay on top of it and not forget about it, I think is useful. And even if it means you and your friends canvassing, then this website has a canvassing website, or going to the neighborhood and finding out what are their immediate concerns. If that chemical plant, did people lose their jobs? There might be a myriad of things that might be going on in that specific neighborhood if you're not from there. So just staying on top of it, and if we can Instagram and use social media to talk about this in about 3 to 4 or 6 weeks from now, I think can be powerful.
And just seeing so it's an investigation into what happened, but what about afterwards? What are they doing now? Are they cleaning it up? This isn't just a isolated event that just happens and then people move on with their lives and people are displaced. It's just there's environmental effects to what just happened, and who's around there and who's doing the cleaning. Who is doing the cleaning? Is it poor people? It's so layered, and there's so much research to be done that it's kind of an interesting research topic to take on.
Yeah, and I just found another website too. It's an environmental action group. A lot of cities, but Philly I think is very politically active, especially on the leftist liberal side of things. So I mean, join the email group and see where it goes from there. Stay on top of it.
Yeah.
So that wraps up the questions, unless Wise I see typing. Oh no, cool, we rock. Thank you. So that wraps up the Q&A part of all this, and wraps up the entire Qatra session to begin with. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us, who's been chatting it up on the side, asking questions. We hope you found this super informative. After this ends, you'll also receive an email thanking you, and it'll ask for feedback. So, if there's anything that you think we could do better, by all means, please let us know. We do have 2 more sessions coming up on various topics, so we definitely want to make this experience as well thought out as possible. G, Arash, anything you guys want to add?
No. Thank you for joining.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good Sunday evening.
Bye.